The well had no business being so deep. Lucy had passed it 100 times on her way to the village market, always giving it a wide berth, always noting how the stones around its mouth were slick with green moss, and how the rope that hung from its rotting crossbeam swayed even when there was no wind. The old women of Veldmoor said the well had been dug by hands that no longer existed, that the water at its bottom tasted of iron and old grief. Lucy had never tested that claim. She had no reason to lean over the edge and look down into that kind of darkness. Until the whimpering started. It was the last week before the first frost of the season, and the sky above the pine forest carried that particular gray weight that meant snow before nightfall. Lucy pulled her wool shawl tighter across her shoulders and stopped walking. The whimpering came again. Thin, ragged, unmistakably alive. She turned toward the well. She told herself later that she should have kept walking. She was already late returning from the mill, her basket heavy with the grain sacks her uncle had sent her to collect, and the light was failing fast. The path from the well to the edge of Veldmoor was not a safe one after dark. Everyone in the village knew that the northern woods belonged to the wolf packs, and that the wolf packs answered to something older and more dangerous than simple animal instinct. They answered to a king, and the king's territory did not end at the tree line. But the whimpering did not stop. Lucy set her basket down in the mud beside the path and approached the well. The stones were cold under her palms. As she leaned over the edge and looked down, the shaft dropped into shadow almost immediately, but she could hear water far below, and above the sound of that water she could hear breathing, unsteady, exhausted, frightened. "Hello?" she said, feeling immediately foolish. Something moved at the edge of the darkness. Then she saw it. A wolf cub, impossibly small, clinging to a narrow ledge of broken stone, about 2 body lengths below the mouth of the well. Its fur was dark gray, matted with mud and water, and its eyes, when they caught the last pale light filtering down from above, were the color of winter ice. It was looking directly at her, not with the blank animal desperation she might have expected, with something else, something that made her breath catch. It was looking at her the way a person looks at another person when they have given up hope, and then, against all reason, found it again. "All right," Lucy said quietly. "All right, I see you." The rope on the crossbeam was rotten, but it held when she tugged it hard twice. She tested her weight against it, found it grudging but functional, and began to lower herself over the edge. The stones scraped her knees through her skirt. The cold rose up from below like breath from something sleeping. She moved slowly, hand over hand, until her feet found the same ledge of broken stone where the cub was pressed against the shaft wall. Up close, it was shaking, the whole small body trembling with cold and exhaustion. Lucy could see a thin cut along its left foreleg, where it must have scrabbled against the stone trying to climb out on its own. "I'm going to pick you up," she told it. "Don't bite me." The cub did not bite her. It pressed its nose once against her wrist, brief, deliberate, almost ceremonial, and then allowed her to tuck it inside her shawl against her chest. It was heavier than it looked, dense with muscle even at that age, even half-starved and frozen. Lucy climbed back up one-handed, the rope burning her palm, the cub still and surprisingly calm against her ribs. She pulled them both over the edge and collapsed in the mud beside the well, breathing hard. For a long moment, she simply lay there looking up at the gray sky. The cub's head emerged from the shawl, and it looked up at the same sky. And something about that shared moment, the girl and the wolf staring at the same nothing, struck her as so strange and so complete that she almost laughed. Then she heard the horses, 3 of them, coming fast from the direction of the northern tree line, their hooves churning the soft ground of the path into dark furrows. Lucy sat up. The riders wore gray cloaks and carried no torches, which meant they were comfortable moving in failing light, which meant they were not ordinary men. At their center rode someone on a black horse so large it seemed less like an animal, and more like a decision made physical, something irreversible and absolute moving through the world. Lucy stood. The cub pressed deeper into her shawl. The riders slowed as they reached the well. The 2 flanking men spread slightly outward in a gesture that was not quite threatening, and not quite anything else, simply positioning, like pieces on a game board finding their natural places. The figure on the black horse looked down at her. He was young. That was the first thing that surprised her. She had built a different image in her mind over the years of hearing his name spoken in careful, lowered voices around Veldmoor, something older, rougher, carved by years of ruling a territory that answered only to teeth and consequence. but he was perhaps 5 or 6 years older than her own 23, with a jaw that carried tension like a held breath, and dark eyes that swept the scene in a single efficient motion. He wore leather and fur against the cold. A long scar ran from below his left ear to the edge of his jaw. His gaze moved from Lucy's face to the shape under her shawl, and something in his expression shifted in a way she could not name. "That cub," he said. His voice was even, uninflected, the voice of someone who did not often need to repeat himself. "Where did you find it?" "The well," Lucy said. She was aware that her knees were muddy and her hair was pulling loose from its braid, and she was holding a wolf inside her shawl. She held his gaze anyway. It fell in. Or was pushed. I don't know which. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he looked at the well. Then back at her. "You went in after it," he said. It was not a question. "Partially," she said. "I didn't go all the way to the bottom." One of the flanking men made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite anything she could categorize. The man on the black horse did not look at his companion. He kept his eyes on Lucy, and she had the unsettling sensation of being assessed in ways she did not have the vocabulary to describe. "Give it to me," he said finally. Lucy looked down at the cub, which had pushed its gray head fully out of the shawl now, and was watching the black horse with an expression that might, on a human face, have been relief. She looked back up at the man. "Its leg is cut," she said. "The left foreleg. It should be cleaned before it becomes infected." A pause. Long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. Long enough for the wind to move through the pine trees at the edge of the path and carry with it the smell of resin and cold and the first suggestion of snow. "I know how to care for my own," he said. "I didn't say you didn't." Something moved behind his eyes. Brief and unreadable. He extended one hand downward, steady, unhurried, completely certain it would be obeyed, and Lucy reached into her shawl and carefully transferred the cub. His fingers closed around the small animal with a sureness that was almost gentle. The cub pressed its nose against his wrist in the same brief, deliberate way it had pressed against Lucy's, and the man's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. He did not leave immediately. He looked at her once more, and this time the assessment in his gaze had shifted into something else, something she would spend a long time afterward trying to name. "You're from the village," he said. "Yes." "You'll be cold walking back. The snow will start within the hour." She waited to see where that observation was going. It did not appear to be going anywhere. He simply stated it, as though informing her of a fact she might have overlooked, and then turned the black horse and rode back toward the tree line without another word. His two companions fell in behind him. Within moments, the sound of hooves had faded into the gray distance. Lucy stood beside the old well in the gathering dark, her shawl empty, her palm still burning from the rope, and the inexplicable certainty settling over her that something had just begun. She picked up her basket and walked home. It began to snow before she reached the village gate. Winter came to Veldmoor the way it always did, without apology. Within 3 days of the night at the well, the path to the northern woods had disappeared under 2 feet of snow. The market stalls closed their shutters until spring, and the village pulled itself inward like an animal seeking its own warmth. Fires burned in every hearth from dusk to dawn. The smell of wood smoke was constant, layered over everything, over the bread baking in the communal oven, over the hay stored in the barns, over the wet wool drying beside every door. Lucy's uncle, Edrin, did not ask where she had been the night she returned late with mud on her knees and snow in her hair. He was not a man who asked questions he did not want answered. He simply looked at her over his bowl of evening broth, noted the state of her, and returned his attention to his food. That was the nature of their arrangement. She kept his house, ground his grain, managed his accounts at the market, and he allowed her to exist within his walls, without demanding she account for herself beyond the minimum. It was not warmth. It was not cruelty. It was a transaction dressed in the clothing of family. She had lived in his house since she was 9 years old, when her parents had died of the river fever that swept through the lower settlements, one particularly wet spring. She had learned early that gratitude was the price of shelter, and she had paid it without complaint for 14 years. She was good at making herself small when smallness was required. She was good at being useful without being noticed. What she was not good at was forgetting things that had fixed themselves in her memory with the particular permanence of moments that changed the shape of everything that came after. She kept thinking about the cub's eyes. the intelligence in them, the way it had pressed its nose against her wrist before allowing her to carry it. That small, deliberate gesture that felt less like animal instinct and more like acknowledgement. And she kept thinking about the man on the black horse, which was a different kind of thinking entirely, and one she tried harder to set aside. Roman. She had never heard his name spoken directly, only around, the way people speak around a fire they respect too much to approach, the Alpha King of the Northern Pax. The one whose territory had expanded over the last decade until it swallowed half the forest between Veldmoor and the mountain ranges. The one whose wolves had been seen at the edge of the village fields, 3 harvests running, watching, never threatening, never retreating either. Just present, like weather. The village elder, a broad-shouldered woman named Sarah, had established an uneasy understanding with the pack years ago. Wolves did not enter the village boundary. Villagers did not enter the northern woods. Both sides maintained the arrangement with the careful attention people give to agreements they know could break at any moment. Lucy had broken it, technically, by going to the well. The well sat outside the formal village boundary, in the gray zone between Veldmoor and the tree line, where nobody claimed ownership, and everyone quietly avoided. She had not thought about that when she heard the whimpering. She thought about it now. She was thinking about it on the morning the woman appeared at Edrin's door. Lucy was sweeping snow from the front step when she heard boots on the path and looked up to find a tall figure in a gray cloak watching her from the gate. A woman, perhaps 40, with the kind of face that had been beautiful once and had traded beauty for authority with no sense of loss. She had pale eyes and the particular posture of someone who was accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any given room. "You're Lucy," the woman said. Not a question. "I am," Lucy said carefully. "I'm Marin." She paused to allow the name to mean something, then appeared to calculate that it wouldn't, and continued. "I manage the Alpha King's household." Lucy kept her face still. "What can I do for you?" "Invite me in, for a start. It's cold." Edrin was out at the granary, which was fortunate. Lucy brought Marin inside, set water to heat over the fire, and waited. Marin sat at the kitchen table without being invited, and looked around the small room with the assessing eye of someone pricing inventory. "The cub you pulled from the well," Marin said finally. "His name is Finn. He's 8 years old and he's the son of Roman's 3rd lieutenant. He wandered from the pack on a dare and fell in sometime in the night. By the time they found his scent trail, it was nearly dark." She folded her hands on the table. "Without your intervention, he would have been dead before morning. The cold alone would have finished him." Lucy said nothing, waiting. "Roman sent me to offer compensation," Marin said. "Name a price." "There's no price," Lucy said. "I heard him and I got him out. That's all it was." Marin studied her with those pale eyes. "Everyone has a price. Then mine is nothing," Lucy said. "Tell him the debt is cleared." A silence settled between them, filled with the sound of wind against the shutters and the soft shift of burning wood in the hearth. Marin did not appear offended. She appeared, if anything, more interested. "He said you told him to clean the cub's wound," Marin said. "I noticed it was injured. You gave an instruction to the Alpha King. I made an observation about an animal that needed care." Lucy poured hot water into 2 clay cups and set one in front of Marin. "There's a difference. Not many people see one." Marin wrapped her hands around the cup and was quiet for a moment. Then she said without particular inflection, "He wants to see you." The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches of the old elm in Edrin's yard with a sound like slow breathing. "Why?" Lucy asked. "He didn't explain himself to me." A faint suggestion of something crossed Marin's face. Not quite amusement, not quite anything definable. "In my experience, he rarely does." Lucy thought about the night at the well. The way the darkness had come up from below like something patient and permanent. The weight of the cub against her chest. The man on the black horse looking down at her with that expression she still had not found a name for. She thought about the agreement between the village and the northern packs, and about what it meant that the Alpha King's household manager was sitting at her kitchen table. "When?" she said. "Tomorrow morning. I'll come for you at first light." Marin stood, drawing her cloak closed. "Wear something warm. The hall is stone and the fires don't reach every corner." She was at the door when Lucy said, "The cub, Finn, is he recovered?" Marin paused with her hand on the frame. For a moment she was still, And when she looked back at Lucy, there was something in her expression that was different from everything that had come before it. Softer, perhaps, or more complicated. "He hasn't stopped talking about you," Maren said. "He calls you the girl from the well." Then she was gone, her boots quiet on the snow-covered path, her gray cloak blending with the gray morning until she disappeared entirely. Lucy stood in the doorway for a long moment. The cold pressed against her face. Down the village lane, smoke rose from chimneys in soft columns, and the sound of someone chopping wood echoed from the direction of the smithy, steady and ordinary and completely unchanged. She closed the door. She would need to tell Edren something. She would need to find a reason that would satisfy him without alarming him. She would need to be careful and measured and practical, which was what she always was, which was what 14 years of careful surviving had made her. But underneath all of that, underneath the practical calculations and the careful management of consequence, something else was moving. Something she had not felt in a very long time. If she had ever felt it at all, she wanted to go. Not because she was summoned, not because she owed anything to anyone in the Northern Hall or felt the pull of obligation, but because the cub had looked at her the way the man on the black horse had looked at her, with that specific weight of recognition that implied a history she had not yet lived, and she needed to understand what it meant. She banked the fire for the night and went to find her warmest boots. Maren arrived before the sun did. Lucy was already awake, dressed in her heaviest skirt and the wool coat she kept for the coldest weeks of winter. Dark green, slightly too large, inherited from a woman she barely remembered. She had told Edren she was visiting the healer on the eastern side of the village, which was plausible enough. He had grunted without looking up from his ledger. That was all the permission she needed and all the farewell she received. The morning was brutal. The cold had the particular quality of the hours just before dawn, not the honest cold of midnight or the retreating cold of late morning, but the mean, dense cold of a world that has forgotten warmth entirely. Lucy's breath came in short clouds as she followed Maren down the village lane and out through the eastern gate, then north along a path Lucy had never taken, parallel to the tree line, cutting across open ground where the snow lay undisturbed and blue-white in the pre-dawn dark. Maren walked quickly and said nothing. Lucy matched her pace and asked nothing. They understood each other in that way almost immediately, two women accustomed to moving through the world efficiently, without decoration. The forest received them without ceremony. One moment they were in the open field. The next, the pine trees rose on either side, and the quality of the silence changed entirely. Inside the forest, the wind dropped away, and the cold became cleaner, drier, smelling of resin and frozen bark and the particular mineral stillness of deep winter woodland. The snow here was thinner, filtered through the canopy above, and their boots found firmer ground beneath it. Lucy was aware, without being able to say precisely how, that they were being watched, not with malice, not with the feeling of a predator tracking prey. Something else. The attentive awareness of a place that registered the presence of those moving through it and filed that information somewhere useful. Once, between two close-growing pines, she caught a flash of yellow-gray in the shadows that was there, and then was not. She did not stop walking. She did not look directly at it. She filed it away the way she filed away most things, quietly for later consideration. After perhaps half an hour, the trees thinned and the hall emerged. She had expected something crude. The village stories described the northern hall in terms that suggested a den more than a structure. Something dug into the earth, low-ceilinged, smelling of animal and violence. What she found instead was a building of dark timber and rough stone that sat against a natural rise in the landscape, with the settled confidence of something that had grown there over centuries. Smoke rose from 3 separate chimneys. The great wooden doors at its entrance were carved with interlocking patterns she did not have the vocabulary to interpret. 2 men stood on either side of those doors, cloaked in gray, watching her approach with the same quality of attention the forest had offered. Present, assessing, not hostile. Maren did not slow down. The doors opened before she reached them. Inside, the hall was enormous. The ceiling rose to exposed rafters hung with dried herbs, and the occasional iron hook from which tools and game bags were suspended. The floor was stone, covered in places with heavy woven rugs in patterns of dark red and gray and forest green. At the far end of the hall, a fireplace large enough to stand inside, burned with a fire that sent heat rolling outward in waves. Long tables ran the length of the central space, empty now in the early hour but bearing the evidence of last night's gathering. Cups not yet collected, the remains of bread, a spilled candle burned down to its base, and people. More than she expected. Moving between the tables, speaking in low voices, carrying things from one part of the hall to another with the practiced efficiency of a community that knew its own rhythms. They were not all what Veldmore's stories had promised. There were children. There were women older than Edrin. There was a man with a long red beard repairing a chair in the corner with the focused attention of a craftsman who loves his work. They noticed Lucy the way they might notice weather, with awareness but without alarm. Then Finn found her. She heard him before she saw him, a quick series of footsteps crossing stone faster than was perhaps advisable. And then a small figure inserted itself directly in front of her path and stopped, forcing her to stop too. He was slight for 8, with dark hair that needed cutting and those same winter ice eyes she remembered from the well, now set in a face that was very much alive and very much assessing her with an intensity that sat slightly outside the range of normal childlike curiosity. His left forearm bore a thin bandage. "You're the girl from the well," he said. "I'm Lucy," she said. He considered this. "Roman says I'm not supposed to run in the hall." "You were running," she observed. "I know." He did not appear troubled by this contradiction. He fell into step beside her, as Marin continued leading Lucy toward a passage at the far end of the hall. "Are you here because Roman sent for you?" "I am." "He doesn't send for people very often," Finn said. "Mostly people come to him because they want something. When he sends for someone, it's different." He paused to consider his own statement. "I think it means he's the one who wants something. But I don't know what he wants from you. Neither do I," Lucy said honestly. Finn nodded as though this confirmed something he had suspected. "I told him you were brave," he said. "When he asked me what I remembered about you, I told him you came down into the dark after me, even though you didn't have to." He glanced up at her sideways. That was brave. Most people don't do things they don't have to do. Lucy thought about that for a moment. "Maybe they do," she said. "Maybe they just need to hear the right sound." Finn seemed to find this satisfying. He peeled away from her side at the entrance to the passage, apparently having decided that his escort duty was complete, and disappeared back into the main hall at a pace that was technically not running. Marin led her through the passage and stopped before a heavy door. She knocked twice, received no audible response, and opened it anyway. Then she stepped aside. Lucy went in. The room was smaller than she expected. A working space, not a throne room. A broad table covered in maps and correspondence, a pair of chairs before a fire smaller than the one in the hall, a narrow window looking out into the pale morning light, beginning now to filter through the pine trees. Shelves of a roughly carved bookcase held ledgers, tools, and what appeared to be a collection of stones. She did not have time to examine them further, because the man standing at the window turned when she entered, and she found herself for the second time under the full weight of Roman's attention. Daylight made him different, not lesser, if anything more, because she could see clearly now what the gray dusk at the well had only suggested. The scar along his jaw, the way he held himself, straight without stiffness, like something load-bearing that had never once considered collapsing. He was dressed more simply than she expected for someone receiving a guest. Dark trousers, a plain linen shirt, boots that had seen significant use. No performance of authority. He apparently did not feel he needed one. "Sit," he said, and gestured to one of the chairs before the fire. Lucy sat. He remained standing for a moment, and she had the impression this was not calculation, but simply his natural relationship with stillness. He moved when he had somewhere to go, and he was still when he did not. Then he sat across from her. "Marin tells me you refused compensation," he said. "There was nothing to compensate," Lucy said. "I didn't do it as a service. Then why did you do it?" She looked at him steadily. "Because he was frightened and cold and alive, and I could hear him. That seems sufficient reason." Roman was quiet for a moment. His hands rested on the arms of the chair with a stillness that was not tension, but its opposite. The stillness of someone who had long ago made peace with patience. Outside the narrow window, the morning was brightening by degrees. "Finn said you told him not to bite you," Roman said. "I did." "And he didn't." "No." He bites everyone, Roman said. There was no humor in his tone, but something adjacent to it, tucked back far enough to maintain deniability. Maybe he was tired, Lucy said. Maybe. He studied her. Or maybe he recognized something. She waited to see if he would explain what he meant. He did not. He shifted his gaze briefly to the fire, and in that moment of inattention, she studied him as frankly as he had been studying her, the scar. The exhaustion that lived behind the steadiness in his eyes, visible now that she was close enough, and the light was good enough to see past the surface. It was an old exhaustion, not last night's poor sleep, but years of something. Carrying, deciding, watching, losing. The particular tiredness of people who have been responsible for others for so long, they can no longer clearly remember what it felt like to be responsible only for themselves. She recognized it. She lived with a version of it herself. You lead a large pack, she said. 11 families, he said. 43 people, plus the 4 who came from the Eastern Ridge last autumn. That's a great deal to manage. It is. He looked back at her. You manage your uncle's household. She kept her expression neutral. I do. His accounts, his grain supply, his agreements at the market, a pause. He doesn't deserve you. The directness of it landed without warning. Lucy felt the words find something underneath her composure, some softer layer she generally kept well covered, and had to take a careful breath before she responded. That's not your concern, she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. He stood then, moving to the table covered in maps, and she understood the conversation was shifting rather than ending. He turned one of the maps toward her. It showed the territory around Veldmoor, the forest, the paths, the river to the east, the mountain outline to the north. His lands and hers, rendered in ink on old parchment. There's a problem developing at the southern boundary of the forest, he said. Hunters from the lowland settlements have been pushing further north each season. Last month they took 3 of my pack's wolves in traps set well inside territory they have no right to enter. His voice remained even, but underneath it something moved, controlled but present. If this continues, I'll have no choice but to respond in kind. And a response in kind will end the arrangement Veldmoor has maintained with my pack for 20 years. Lucy looked at the map. She understood now why she was here, or thought she did. Perhaps he wanted her to carry a message to the village elder, Sarah. Perhaps this was practical and transactional after all, and the night at the well was simply the circumstance that had identified her as useful. You want me to speak to Sarah? She said. No, he said. Sarah is not the problem. The hunters are not from Veldmoor. They're from further south, and Sarah has no more authority over them than I do over the weather. He looked at her across the table. I want you to read this correspondence and tell me what I'm missing. She blinked. I beg your pardon? You manage accounts. You understand contracts and agreements and the way people use language to mean things they don't say directly. He pushed a folded letter across the map toward her. I received this from the Lowland Settlements Council 3 weeks ago. My lieutenants say it's a formal apology. I don't believe them. Lucy looked at the letter. Then she looked at him. You have people who advise you, she said carefully. I have people who tell me what they think I want to hear, he said. That is a different thing. She picked up the letter. The handwriting was careful, practiced. Someone who understood that how a letter looked was part of what it said. She read through it once quickly, and then again slowly, paying attention to the specific words chosen in each sentence. The apologies were there, yes. But they were structured in a particular way. Each concession paired with a phrase that quietly reopened the question it had just closed. We regret the incursion into contested territory. Contested. Not his territory. Contested. They're not apologizing, she said. They're establishing language. They want this correspondence on record as evidence that the territory boundary is disputed, not established. If this goes before a council or an arbitration, they'll cite this letter as proof that you acknowledged uncertainty about the boundary by accepting their apology rather than rejecting their framing. The room was very quiet. Roman looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, exactly, but the recalibration that follows when something confirms a calculation you weren't entirely sure about. My lieutenants didn't see that, he said. Your lieutenants were probably reading for tone, Lucy said. Tone is what people use when they want you to stop reading carefully. He was quiet again. Then he said, with the same evenness he used for everything, as though the weight of what he was about to say were no different from commenting on the weather. "I'd like you to come back." She set the letter down on the map. Outside, the morning had arrived fully now, pale winter light filling the narrow window and catching the dust suspended in the warm air above the fire. "To read your correspondence," she said, "among other things." She thought about Edrin's house, the transaction dressed as family, the careful smallness she had learned to wear. She thought about Finn's voice, "Most people don't do things they don't have to do," and the cub's nose against her wrist in the dark at the bottom of the well. That brief, deliberate pressure of recognition. She thought about how, for the first time in longer than she could account for, she did not want to make herself small. "I'll need to know what I'm walking into," she said. "All of it. Not just the letter." "That's fair," he said. "And I'll tell you when I think you're wrong." Something moved across his face. Brief, but this time she was close enough, and the light was good enough that she caught it clearly. It looked, she thought, like relief. "I'd expect nothing less," Roman said. She went back 4 days later, not because she had decided quickly. Lucy was not a woman who decided quickly about anything that mattered. She went back because she had spent 4 days inside Edrin's house, watching the same walls and breathing the same wood smoke and running the same calculations she had been running for 14 years. And at the end of those 4 days, she had arrived at a conclusion that was not comfortable, but was honest. The life she was living in Veldmore was not a life she had chosen. It was a life that had happened to her, and she had been so occupied with surviving it that she had never once stopped to ask whether she might choose something different. She told Edrin she had found supplementary work assisting with record-keeping for a household to the north. She kept her voice flat and practical when she said it, the way she kept her voice flat and practical about everything, and Edrin looked at her with the mild suspicion of a man who senses something he cannot quite identify and decides it is not worth the effort of pursuing. "Which household?" he said. "One that pays," she said. He returned to his ledger. That was all. Marin met her at the tree line again, as though she had been expecting her at precisely that hour, which perhaps she had. They walked the same path through the forest, in a silence that was different from the first time. Less careful, more established. The trees received her the same way, with that quality of attentive stillness, but this time Lucy felt the watching without unease. It was not threatening. It was something closer to acknowledgement. Finn was waiting in the hall doorway when they arrived. "You came back," he said, with the satisfaction of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. "I said I would," Lucy told him. "People say things," he said, with the philosophical weight of someone who has learned this the hard way, and earlier than most. Then he brightened. "I can show you where everything is. Marin showed me when I first came to live here, and I remember all of it." "Finn." Marin's voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "She's not here for a tour. She should know where the kitchens are," Finn said, entirely unrepentant. "Everyone should know where the kitchens are." Lucy spent that first morning in the room off the main hall that functioned as Roman's working space, going through 3 months of accumulated correspondence with the systematic attention she had learned managing Edrin's market accounts. The letters were a map of a world she had not previously had access to. Councils and settlements and territorial agreements and old disputes resurfacing under new language. She read each one twice, sorted them into categories, and began a set of notes in the margin of a blank ledger page she found in the desk drawer. Roman came and went throughout the morning. He did not hover. He did not explain himself or offer context unprompted, but when she asked direct questions, and she asked several, he answered them with the same directness, without the hedging she had grown accustomed to hearing from men who were unaccustomed to being questioned by women they did not outrank. He answered as though her questions were reasonable, which they were, and as though her understanding mattered to the outcome, which apparently it did. By midday, she had identified 2 letters that required immediate response, one that appeared innocent, but contained the same quiet linguistic manipulation as the Lowland Council's apology, and one that she set aside with a small notation that said simply, "Who wrote this? And do they know you personally?" Roman picked up that last letter when he returned at midday, read her notation, and was still for a moment. "Why do you ask?" he said. "The handwriting changes in the 3rd paragraph," she said. The first 2 paragraphs were written carefully. The 3rd was written quickly, by someone who forgot to be careful. "The phrasing in that paragraph is personal. Whoever wrote it knows how you think." He set the letter down. "Her name is Vesa," he said. She was my father's advisor before she was removed from the position. She's been living in the eastern settlements for 3 years. She wants to come back, Lucy said. It was not a question. She wants more than that. He sat across from her. My father's death left questions about succession that I resolved through challenge and consensus. But Vesa has spent 3 years arguing to anyone who will listen that the resolution was incomplete. That there are claims still outstanding, he paused. There are not. But the argument itself is the weapon. You don't need to be right. You need to create enough uncertainty that people stop trusting what they know. Lucy looked at him. The morning light through the narrow window had shifted to the flatter light of midday, and in it he looked tired in a way he had not quite allowed her to see during their first meeting. The controlled exhaustion she had noticed then was more visible now, as though 4 days had worn something further down. How long has she been doing this? Lucy asked. Since the week after my father's funeral, he said. She thought about that. 3 years of managing a pack of 47 people while someone worked systematically at the foundations of his authority. 3 years of knowing the threat existed and being unable to address it directly without giving it more weight than it deserved. Responding to her directly would be a mistake, Lucy said. It elevates the argument. I know. But ignoring her entirely is also a mistake, because silence reads as either guilt or weakness depending on who's watching. I know that too, he said. I haven't found the position between those two things. The position between them is noise, Lucy said. You don't respond to her. You make her irrelevant by being so clearly and specifically what you are that her version of you can't find purchase anywhere. People don't abandon a story because they're told it's wrong. They abandon it because a truer story becomes available. He looked at her across the table covered in letters and maps, and the quality of that look was something she was beginning to recognize. The recalibration. The moment after something lands, you're going to be trouble, he said. You asked me to tell you when I thought you were wrong, she said. I haven't done that yet. I've only agreed with you. Something close to a real expression crossed his face, gone quickly. But there. She settled into a rhythm over the following weeks. She came to the hall in the mornings, worked through the correspondence, sat in on the occasional meeting when Roman wanted a second set of eyes on language being used in negotiation, and returned to Veldmore before dark. Finn attached himself to her presence the way small creatures attach to reliable warmth, without asking permission and without apparent self-consciousness about it. He appeared at her elbow during work sessions to ask questions that were sometimes surprisingly perceptive, and sometimes simply the questions of an 8-year-old who had not yet learned which thoughts were appropriate to share aloud. She did not discourage either kind. His father, a broad, quiet man named Davan, watched this attachment with an expression she couldn't quite read the first time she noticed it. She was helping Finn work through a passage in a book he had been attempting, one of the hall's small collection of texts, battered and clearly much read, when she became aware of Davan standing in the doorway of the side room, where she and Finn had settled themselves beside the fire. She looked up. He doesn't usually accept help, Davan said, reading. He usually insists he can manage alone. He can manage alone, Lucy said. He's doing well. Finn, who had looked up at the sound of his father's voice, glanced between the two adults with the particular wariness of a child who senses a conversation happening above his head. I'm not a child, he announced. You're 8, his father said. 8 is almost 9, Finn said, and returned to his book with great dignity. Davan looked at Lucy. Something passed between them that didn't require words, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the specific shape of Finn's self-sufficiency and where it had likely come from. Then he nodded once and left. It was Marin who told her about Roman's father. Not deliberately, and not all at once. It came out in pieces over the course of several evenings when Lucy stayed later than she had planned, because a particular set of correspondence required more time. And Marin brought food to the working room, and stayed to talk in the way of women who have been alone with their own thoughts for too long. His name had been Aldrich. He had been, by all accounts, a man of considerable power and considerably less wisdom, the kind of leader who confused fear with loyalty and strength with the willingness to cause pain. He had built the Northern Pax territory through expansion that was more conquest than negotiation, and he had ruled it with the assumption that the world would simply continue to arrange itself according to his preferences. Roman had grown up watching this. He had also grown up watching what it cost, The lieutenants who disappeared when they disagreed, the families who left quietly in the night rather than continue under those conditions, the slow erosion of something that might have been a community into something that was only an arrangement held together by apprehension. When Aldrich died, of a fever in the end, not in battle as the stories later suggested, Roman had been 21 years old and had already decided what kind of leader he would not be. What kind of leader he would be instead had taken longer to work out. Maren said this without judgment, as a simple statement of observed fact. It had taken him years of getting things wrong in new ways instead of old ones. Years of learning that the opposite of cruelty is not softness, but something more precise and harder to maintain. He doesn't trust easily, Maren said. They were sitting beside the fire in the main hall, the long tables cleared, the hall quiet around them. He hasn't had much evidence that it pays. Lucy thought about this. He trusted me with his correspondence after one meeting, she said. Yes. Maren looked at her steadily. I noticed that too. There was something in Maren's gaze she chose not to examine too closely. Not yet. She finished her cup and began gathering her things for the walk back to Veldmoor. The woman, she said. Vesa. Has anyone met with her directly? Anyone from the pack? Maren stilled slightly. Why? Because the letters have been coming more frequently, Lucy said. 4 in the last 6 weeks, and each one goes to a different person. Not always Roman. She's widening the distribution, which means she's getting ready to make a move and she wants the argument already in circulation before she does. She pulled on her coat. Whatever she's planning, it's soon. Maren was quiet for a moment, then she said, Roman should hear this. I know, Lucy said. I'll tell him in the morning. But the morning brought something else first. She was halfway to the hall along the forest path, the pre-dawn air sharp with cold and the snow underfoot compressed and firm from days of hard freeze, when she heard voices ahead. She slowed without stopping, moving more carefully, and came to the edge of a small clearing where the path widened before curving toward the hall's outer boundary. There were 3 men in the clearing, 2 she recognized as belonging to the pack. She had seen them in the hall during meetings, quiet presences on the periphery. The third she did not know. He was heavy-set, wearing lowland-style clothing under a fur cloak, and he was speaking with the particular low urgency of someone delivering information that has been paid for. She could not hear everything. What she heard was enough. Her name. Her own name, spoken by the stranger in a tone that turned it into a category rather than a person. The woman Roman brought in, the one handling his letters, and then, from one of the 2 pack men, the taller one, whose name she had never learned, a quieter response. Something about the correspondence. Something about Vesa. Something about how the information Lucy had been compiling in her daily notes was considerably more useful in other hands than Roman's. The cold pressed against her face. She did not move. She stood between 2 pine trees in the frozen dark and understood with complete and terrible clarity that she had been useful in ways she had not intended, and that someone had been watching her be useful and calculating what that usefulness was worth to them. The 3 men dispersed in different directions. The stranger went south. The 2 pack members went toward the hall. Lucy stood still for another full minute. Her breath came in slow, deliberate clouds. She thought about the letters she had catalogued, the notes she had made, the specific details she had written down about territorial boundaries and internal disputes, and the exact nature of Vesa's legal argument against Roman succession. All of it, rendered into neat handwriting in a ledger that sat, this moment, in the unlocked drawer of the desk in Roman's working room. She made a decision. She did not continue toward the hall along the main path. She moved instead to the left, through the trees, circling wide around the clearing, and approaching the hall from the eastern side, where a smaller door opened near the kitchens. She knew the hall well enough now to move through it without drawing attention. She went directly to the working room, removed the ledger from the desk, and was sitting at the table reading it with a cup of cold water and an expression of absolute calm when Roman arrived 20 minutes later. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her, at the ledger, at the cup of water, at the careful arrangement of her stillness. "You're here early," he said. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about 2 of your men, and I need to show you something in this ledger before it leaves this room." He came in and closed the door. She told him everything she had heard in the clearing. She told him precisely and without embellishment, names where she had them, exact phrasing where she remembered it, honest uncertainty where she did not. She watched his face while she spoke. She had learned his face well enough by now to read the careful management of it, the way the jaw set and the eyes steadied when something landed that he had not seen coming. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "The tall one," he said. "How certain are you?" "Certain enough that I'm telling you," she said. "Not certain enough to stake someone's life on it without verification." He nodded. He was looking at the ledger. "The notes," he said. "How much is in there?" "Enough to give Vesa what she needs if she doesn't already have it," Lucy said. "Which is why I took it from the drawer before I said a word." He looked at her then. Fully, the way he had looked at her at the well in the failing light, with that weight that implied more history than they had yet accumulated together, except this time there was something else in it. Something that sat underneath the assessment and the recalibration and all the practical layers of a man who thought in terms of territory and consequence. She held his gaze. "You could have used this," he said quietly. "The information. You've had access to it for weeks." "I know," she said. "But you're handing it to me instead." "I'm telling you there's a problem inside your own hall," she said. "What you do with that is your decision, not mine." She closed the ledger and pushed it across the table toward him. "But I'd suggest you move quickly. Whatever Vesa is planning, she's close to ready." He took the ledger. He did not look away from her face. "Why are you here, Lucy?" he said. Not with suspicion. With something that was almost, underneath all its careful management, something desperate to understand. She thought about the well, the darkness and the cold, and the small body trembling against her chest. She thought about Finn saying most people don't do things they don't have to do. She thought about 4 days in Edrin's house and 14 years of making herself small, because I heard something that needed me, she said. Same reason as the first time. He held that for a long moment. Then he stood and moved to the door, and called for Marin. And the morning began in full. The betrayal had a name by nightfall. Roman moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that anger, when acted upon too quickly, tends to destroy the wrong things. He spent the morning in a series of conversations Lucy was not present for. She remained in the working room, reorganizing the correspondence into a new system she had devised that would make it considerably harder for anyone to extract specific information without leaving evidence of having done so. She could hear, distantly, the sounds of the hall shifting around whatever was happening. Doors. Voices dropping when they should have carried. The particular silence that falls over a community when it understands that something is being resolved and has the collective wisdom to stay out of the way. By midday, the tall man's name was confirmed. Bren. He had been with the pack for 6 years, had come originally from a settlement to the southeast, and had, Marin told Lucy quietly over a lunch neither of them ate much of, a younger brother living in the eastern settlements where Vesa had made her home for 3 years. The second man, the one who had said less in the clearing, turned out to have heard rather than participated. He came to Roman voluntarily before Roman came to him, which Roman apparently considered significant enough to affect the outcome for that particular man. Lucy did not know the details of that conversation. She knew only that he emerged from it pale and considerably more present than he had been going in, and that he spent the rest of the day doing visible, effortful work in the hall, with the focused energy of someone who has narrowly avoided something and intends never to be that careless again. Bren was a different matter. Lucy did not see him after the morning. She did not ask what had been decided. This was not her territory in any of the ways that mattered. She had handed Roman the information, made her report with precision and honesty, and the rest belonged to him and to the internal logic of a community navigating its own wound. She understood the boundary, and she respected it. What she did not expect was Finn. He found her in the late afternoon, after the hall had settled back into its rhythms, and the gray winter light through the windows had begun its early retreat toward dark. He came and sat beside her at the long table without asking, which was his customary approach to most things, and was quiet for longer than was usual for him. Lucy continued working. She had learned that Finn's silences were not empty. They were loading, like a bow being drawn. "Bren used to teach me to track," he said finally. Lucy set down her pen. "I know," she said, because Marin had mentioned it in passing. "I didn't know he was—" Finn stopped. "Reorganized. I didn't see it. Adults who want to hide things from children are usually successful," Lucy said. "That's not a failure of your perception. It's a failure of his honesty." Finn considered this. Roman says betrayal is the most expensive thing in the world, because you only learn what someone is after you've already trusted them. Roman is right about that. He's right about most things. A pause. He's wrong sometimes too, about people. He trusted Bren. Another pause. Longer. He trusted you faster than he trusted Bren. Lucy was quiet for a moment. Maybe he got lucky, she said. Finn looked at her with those winter ice eyes and the expression of someone who has decided to be patient with an answer that is inadequate, but offered in good faith. Maybe, he said, in a tone that suggested he did not think so. He stayed beside her until the lamps were lit. Then Davin appeared in the doorway, and Finn went without being asked, pausing only to inform Lucy, with great seriousness, that she had left a smudge of ink on her left wrist. She looked down. She had. She thanked him. He nodded gravely and left. She was still sitting with the lamp and the letters when Roman came in. He moved differently than he had in the morning. Not loosened, exactly. She was not sure he had a loosened register, not yet, but something had shifted in the way he carried the day's weight. He sat across from her without preamble, and for a moment said nothing, looking at the organized correspondence on the table between them, with the expression of a man taking inventory of what is still standing. Bren will leave the territory, he said. His choice. The alternative was less comfortable. And Vesa? Lucy asked. We know now what she knows. He leaned back slightly. Which means we know what she'll argue and when. The council meeting in the Eastern Settlements is in 6 weeks. She's been planning to present her succession challenge there, in front of representatives from 4 other Pact territories. He looked at Lucy. With the information from the ledger, she would have had enough to make the challenge credible. Without it. He paused. Without it, she has an argument built on suggestion, and she knows we know the structure of it. She'll adapt, Lucy said. She's been at this for 3 years. She won't simply stop. No, he agreed, she won't. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to the council meeting. Lucy waited. I want you to come with me, he said. She looked at him across the lamplight. The fire had burned lower, and the room was warmer and smaller feeling than it had been in the cold mornings of their first meetings. And she was aware in a way, she had been carefully not examining directly for several weeks, that the distance between the person she had been when she came to this hall and the person she was right now was considerable. Not because of him, exactly. Because of what being in this hall had returned to her. The sense that her mind was a useful thing, that her observations mattered, that the space she occupied in a room was not conditional on her continuing to make herself smaller than the room required. But also, underneath all of that, and below the practical and the careful and the managed, something else. Something that had been building with the slow inevitability of the season itself, as undeniable as the cold and as difficult to look at directly. As your correspondent, she said, testing the boundary of the word. He held her gaze. If that's what you want to call it. She thought about the clearing in the pre-dawn dark. Her name in a stranger's mouth, the 2 pack members and the lowland man and the quiet commerce of betrayal. She thought about Vesa, a woman she had never met, building a case out of language and suggestion, patient and precise and committed to an argument that was fundamentally about who belonged where and who had the right to what they had built. She thought about belonging, about what it felt like to be somewhere that used all of her instead of the portion of her that was convenient to be used. There's something I need to tell you, she said. He waited. He was good at waiting. When I came here the first time, she said, I thought I understood why, the cub, and the letter, and the practical usefulness of having someone who could read correspondence carefully. I told myself it was straightforward. She kept her eyes on his. It isn't straightforward anymore, and I think we both know that. And I think if I come with you to this council meeting, it will be even less straightforward than it is now. And I think you should be honest with me about what you're asking before I agree to it. The lamp flame moved between them in a draft from somewhere. The fire settled. Outside, the wind had picked up with the coming of full dark, and the pine trees at the edge of the hall moved against the sky in long, slow shapes. Roman looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she had not yet seen him do. He let her see him clearly, not the Alpha King, and not the man managing the distance between what he needed and what he allowed himself to want. Just Roman, 27 years old, and 3 years into building something out of the wreckage his father had left behind, surrounded by people he was responsible for, and deeply, specifically, not alone in the way he had been alone before a woman he had never met, had climbed into a frozen well after a child she had no obligation to save. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not the council meeting, not the correspondence. I'm asking you to stop going back to Veldmore at the end of the day and start—" He stopped, found the word. "Start being here. If that's something you can choose. If it's something you want." The wind moved against the hall. Lucy felt the words find the same soft underlayer they had found the first time. "He doesn't deserve you." And this time, she did not close over it. "I want to choose it," she said carefully. "I need it to be a choice and not a gravity. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I understand exactly the difference." She believed him. The council meeting in the eastern settlements came on a Tuesday at the end of the 6th week, in a long stone hall that smelled of tallow candles and old wood and the specific anxiety of people who have gathered to decide something they cannot agree on. Representatives from 5 packed territories sat along the hall's central table. Roman sat at one end. Lucy sat beside him, which was noted and would continue to be noted. And she met every noting gaze steadily and without apology. Vesa arrived late, which was a choice. She was a tall woman, elegantly dressed for the weather, with the kind of composed intelligence in her face that Lucy recognized and respected, even across the specific opposition of this moment. She took her seat at the far end of the table and allowed her gaze to move down the length of it until it reached Roman, and then Lucy, and she paused there for precisely 1 beat longer than was neutral. She was good. Lucy gave her that, internally and without reservation. Her opening argument was structured and delivered with the calm authority of someone who has rehearsed past the point where rehearsal shows. She laid out the succession question, as she had been building it for 3 years, the gaps in the formal process, the witnesses who had not been called, the documentation that had not been produced. She did not know, yet, what Lucy had prepared. Roman had offered to deliver the response himself. Lucy had told him no. Not because she wanted the floor, but because Vesa's argument was built on language, and the most precise answer to a language argument is more precise language. And precision was what Lucy did. She spoke for 11 minutes. She had timed it. She addressed each point in Vesa's argument directly, not with dismissal, but with documentation, the specific records, the witness accounts that had in fact been recorded, the procedural steps that had been followed, and could be demonstrated to have been followed, and the particular way each of Vesa's cited gaps turned out, on examination, to be a gap in Vesa's research rather than in Roman's succession. She saved the linguistic analysis for last. She walked the assembled representatives through the letters, not all of them, the 3 that most clearly demonstrated the pattern, and she explained in plain language the technique Vesa had been using. Not as an accusation, as a demonstration. Here is the word. Here is why that word was chosen. Here is what that choice tells you about the intent of the argument. The room was quiet when she finished. Vesa looked at her from the far end of the table. The composed intelligence in her face had not disappeared. If anything, it had sharpened, refocused. The gaze of someone reassessing the board after an unexpected move. "You've been thorough," Vesa said. "I had good material to work with," Lucy said. The challenge was dismissed before the candles had burned down another inch. Winter broke 6 weeks later, which felt like a metaphor, and probably was. Lucy did not return to Edrin's house for her things. She sent Marin, who accomplished the task with the efficient pleasantness of someone who has delivered more difficult messages and found this one straightforward. Edrin did not protest. She had not expected him to. Finn celebrated her permanent arrival in the hall by presenting her with a small gray stone he had found in the river, which he said had an interesting shape. It did. She kept it on the windowsill of the room that was now hers, where the morning light could find it. Davin came to her one afternoon in early spring, when the snow was pulling back from the southern edges of the forest, and the first small sounds of melt were beginning in the streams. He stood in the doorway with his hands quiet at his sides and said, without preamble, that Finn's mother had died 2 years ago, and that he had been struggling to know how to talk to his son about things that required more gentleness than he knew how to produce, and that he was grateful, if she was willing to receive gratitude, for the way she had received Finn's attachment without making him feel small for having it. She told him she was willing. He nodded once, and left, and she understood that this was what belonging to a place looked like, not a single moment of arrival, but the accumulation of small honest exchanges, one after another, each one adding weight to the foundation until the foundation was undeniable. Roman came to her at dusk on an evening in late spring when the pine trees had taken on the particular deep green of the season's full arrival, and the air smelled of thaw and new earth, and the specific brightness that comes after long cold. They were standing at the eastern edge of the hall's boundary where the ground sloped down toward the river, and the last light was doing something remarkable to the water, and neither of them was talking about anything important when he took her hand. Not with ceremony. The way you take hold of something you have been careful with for a long time and have finally decided to simply hold, she let him. They stood there as the light finished, and the first stars appeared above the pine canopy, and somewhere behind them in the hall, Finn was almost certainly running when he had been told not to, and the fires were being built up for the evening, and the community Roman had spent 3 years building from wreckage was doing what communities do when they are healthy, continuing, easily, without requiring anything dramatic of the moment. Lucy thought about a frozen well in the last gray hour before the first snow of winter. A small body trembling against her chest. A pair of winter ice eyes looking up at her from the dark with the specific expression of someone who has given up hope, and then, against all reason, found it again. She understood now what that expression had recognized. Not her face. Not a rescuer. A beginning. The years that followed were not without difficulty. No true life is, but they were hers. Fully, completely chosen. She became what she had always been capable of being in a place that had room for all of it, the steady intelligence, the precise care, the willingness to climb into the dark when something needed her. Roman led his territory into a period of expansion that was nothing like his father's, built on negotiation and documentation, and the radical idea that people cooperate more reliably when they trust the terms. Lucy's hand was in much of that. She would not have described it as power. She would have described it as use, being used fully, the way a good tool is used, which is the highest compliment she knew how to give a thing. Finn grew. At 12, he was already taller than her shoulder, still asking questions that were sometimes perceptive, and sometimes simply the questions of a 12-year-old who had not learned which thoughts to keep private. He learned to read fluently, with Lucy's help, and eventually without it. He found as he grew that he had a talent for the kind of careful observation that Lucy practiced. The reading of situations, the attention to what people said underneath what they said. Roman told him once, with the slight expression that had by then become familiar and beloved, that he was going to be trouble. Finn had looked at Lucy when Roman said this. She had smiled. He had grinned back. Devon remarried in the autumn of the 3rd year, a woman from the western edge of the territory, steady and warm, who received Finn with the uncomplicated affection of someone who had room to spare. Finn navigated this with the same serious dignity he brought to most things, and on the day of the small ceremony in the hall, Lucy caught him watching his father with an expression that was too complicated for 8 years old, but was perhaps appropriate for 11. Which was what he was by then, an expression that contained both the weight of what had been lost and the careful, tentative recognition that something had been returned. She did not remark on it. She sat beside him and was present, which was what he needed, which was what she had learned to give. Marin stayed. She had not been going anywhere. The hall was as much hers as anyone's, built from her decades of tending it, but she settled into a different kind of presence after Lucy arrived. Less the manager of a man doing his best alone, and more the anchor of a household that had found its shape. They had the friendship of women who came to trust each other through the accumulation of small confidences, none of them dramatic. All of them real. Vesa retired to the western settlements 2 years after the council meeting. Lucy heard this through correspondence, a brief formal letter, addressed to Roman, but carrying in its precise phrasing the acknowledgement of a specific audience. She read it twice, noted its concessions and its dignities, and set it aside with the notation, final. It was. On a morning in the 3rd spring, Roman found the gray stone on the windowsill of their room and asked where it had come from. Lucy told him. He turned it in his hands, a man accustomed to assessing territory, now assessing a small, smooth river stone with the same seriousness, and set it back in the morning light exactly where he had found it. Finn has good instincts, he said. He does, Lucy agreed. Roman looked at her. The scar along his jaw, the exhaustion behind his eyes that was no longer the old exhaustion. Lighter now, different in quality. The exhaustion of a life being fully lived, rather than endlessly defended. I didn't know what I was asking when I sent Marin to you, he said, It was not an apology. It was something more precise, an acknowledgement. "You asked me to tell you when I thought you were wrong," she said. "You haven't given me much opportunity." His expression moved. The thing that had once been brief and quickly hidden was neither of those things anymore. "I'll try harder," he said. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that happens when something is genuinely, completely, exactly right. When the shape of a moment fits the shape of everything that led to it, all the cold and the dark and the careful surviving, and reveals itself to have been, all along, the only way to arrive here. Outside, the pine trees held the morning light. The river ran clear over the stones. Somewhere in the hall, quick footsteps crossed the floor faster than was advisable, and Roman closed his eyes briefly with the patience of a man who has accepted certain recurring facts about his life. And Lucy was already standing to go find Finn before anyone told him to stop running. She went down the corridor with the gray stone light of a spring morning coming through every window, and the smell of breakfast fire from the kitchens, and the sound of a community continuing in all its ordinary and extraordinary noise. And she felt, completely, with her whole self, without reservation, that she was exactly where she had chosen to be, which was, in the end, the only thing that mattered, and it was enough. It was more than enough.